For months, the Strongsville crash looked like a tragedy with unanswered questions. 3 young people had been in the car. 2 were gone. 1 survived. But the case turned when investigators stopped asking only where the car went and started asking what the car itself could prove about the final 5 seconds. On July 31, 2022, in Strongsville, Ohio, 17-year-old Mackenzie Shirilla was driving a Toyota Camry with 2 passengers inside, her boyfriend, 20-year-old Dominic Russo, and their friend, 19-year-old Davion Flanagan. They had been out during the overnight hours, moving between gatherings with friends. By sunrise, the car would be found against a brick building near Progress Drive and Alameda Drive. Subscribe to Starline Daily, like this video, and share it to support us. At first, there was no public murder case. There was a crash scene, a survivor, 2 grieving families, and an investigation that had to sort through every possible explanation. Was it driver error? Was it impairment? Was it a mechanical problem? Was it a medical emergency? Or was something else hidden inside the last moments before impact? The route mattered. Progress Drive is a commercial cut-through road, and court records later described it as rough, older concrete, with curves and a stop sign near the end. It was not a road where a normal early morning drive would be expected to reach highway speeds. A Strongsville officer testified that even driving much slower than the eventual crash speed, the road required control and attention. Before the crash, Mackenzie, Dominic, and Davion had gone to a graduation party. They were later at another friend's house, where testimony described the gathering as calm. One witness said he did not see Mackenzie and Dominic fighting that night. That detail became important because it gave the defense a simple point. If everything seemed normal shortly before the crash, how could prosecutors prove what happened later was intentional? But investigators were not looking at one moment in isolation. They were building a timeline. A phone location app later placed Davion's phone at a Strongsville home from late July 30th until about 5:30 in the morning. It then showed movement for only a few minutes before the crash. That narrow window became the center of the case. The crash was not discovered immediately. According to the prosecutor's office, the site was found about 45 minutes later by a Good Samaritan who called police. Strongsville police and emergency crews responded. Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan were pronounced dead at the scene. Mackenzie survived and was taken to the hospital with serious injuries. In any criminal case, a defendant is presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty in a court of law. That presumption applied to Mackenzie Shirilla when the investigation began, when charges were filed, and when her case moved toward trial. The first major question investigators had to answer was whether the car failed. If the accelerator stuck, if the brakes failed, or if steering control was lost because of a mechanical issue, the case could look very different. But a forensic mechanical expert later testified that he found no pre-crash mechanical or electrical failure that would explain a loss of accelerator control, braking, or steering. That did not end the inquiry. The next question was whether Mackenzie had lost consciousness or suffered some kind of medical episode. Her mother told medical personnel that Mackenzie had a history of POTS, or postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, a condition that can cause dizziness or fainting. Mackenzie would later maintain that she did not remember the moments before impact. The medical issue became one of the most important defense themes. If a blackout happened suddenly, the defense could argue that the crash was not deliberate. Court records show testimony that a person who had suffered something like a seizure or mini-stroke might appear normal by the time they were evaluated 2 hours later. That point left an opening for the defense. But prosecutors argued the physical evidence did not fit a sudden blackout. Medical personnel noted that Mackenzie was alert and oriented during later evaluation, and court records said no cardiovascular, neurologic, joint, or muscle symptoms were noted. Investigators also pointed to the driving path, the acceleration, and what happened with the gear shift in the final seconds. That is where the black box evidence changed the case. The Toyota's event data recorder captured only a few seconds before impact, but those seconds were crucial. According to court records, the accelerator was fully pressed in the final seconds. The brake was not applied. The car was gaining speed. It had made a controlled turn onto Progress Drive before accelerating toward the building. That evidence did 2 things at once. It gave prosecutors a technical explanation for the crash, and it forced the defense to explain why the data showed full acceleration with no braking. A crash can be accidental. A car can go out of control. But the state's argument was that this pattern did not look like panic, confusion, or mechanical failure. It looked like sustained acceleration. There was another detail: the gear shift. Court records say the vehicle was shifted back and forth between drive, sequential, and neutral in the seconds before the crash, and that the gear shift had to be moved manually. The court later noted that someone inside the vehicle moved the gear shift into neutral, but it was forced back into drive while the vehicle continued forward. That detail created one of the most haunting unanswered questions in the case: who moved the gear shift and why? Prosecutors suggested the passengers may have been trying to stop what was happening, but the data could not show exactly whose hand moved it. It could show only that the gear shift moved. The steering data added another layer. The vehicle registered a sharp steering event shortly before impact. Experts acknowledged different possible explanations. It could have been an attempt to regain control. It could have been a passenger reaching for the wheel. It could have been related to the vehicle's movement after it hit a curb and went airborne. What mattered for the prosecution was that none of those possibilities erased the acceleration evidence. The relationship history then became the state's explanation for why the crash may have happened. Court records described testimony that Mackenzie and Dominic's relationship had become strained in the months before the crash. Witnesses described fights, breakups, arguments, and threats. Dominic's mother, Christine Russo, testified that Dominic had called her during a July incident and needed to be picked up. A family friend went to get him. That friend testified that he heard Mackenzie say she was going to wreck the car. The defense disputed the meaning of that incident. Mackenzie's side pointed to claims that Dominic may have grabbed at the wheel or been part of the conflict. The defense also emphasized witnesses who described the relationship as loving and said the two appeared close shortly before the crash. That contrast became one of the reasons this case drew so much attention. There were people who believed the relationship was troubled enough to explain the state's theory. There were also people who believed the relationship history was being used to turn a terrible accident into murder. The court heard both versions. Investigators also reviewed social media and phone evidence. Some of it focused on the relationship, some of it focused on driving behavior. A detective testified that he documented more than 100 instances he characterized as distracted or reckless driving in Mackenzie's social media history. Prosecutors argued this showed a pattern of risky driving. The defense and supporters argued that teenage social media posts and reckless behavior do not automatically prove an intent to kill. That distinction matters. Reckless driving and purposeful murder are not the same thing. To convict Mackenzie of murder, the state had to prove more than speed. It had to prove purpose, that she intentionally caused the deaths of Dominic and Davion. The state's case came down to a combination of evidence: the route, the timing, the speed, the black box data, the absence of braking, the lack of a mechanical defect, the relationship history, the prior threat testimony, the location data, and the court's interpretation of what all of those pieces meant together. The defense countered with its own frame. Mackenzie had no memory of the crash. She had a medical history that could explain a sudden loss of consciousness. People saw affection between her and Dominic, and no one inside the car survived except Mackenzie to explain what happened in those final seconds. Mackenzie did not have a jury trial. She waived her right to a jury and chose a bench trial, meaning Cuyahoga County Common Pleas Judge Nancy Margaret Russo decided the facts and the verdict. The judge was not related to victim Dominic Russo. On August 14, 2023, the court found Mackenzie Shirilla guilty on multiple charges, including 4 counts of murder, 4 counts of felonious assault, 2 counts of aggravated vehicular homicide, drug possession, and possessing criminal tools. The judge's reasoning centered on intent. The court concluded that Mackenzie drove an obscure route, at an early hour accelerated to nearly 100 miles per hour, did not brake, and aimed the car at the building. The judge found that the conduct was controlled, deliberate, and purposeful. For the families of Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan, the verdict answered one question but opened another. The legal system had concluded this was murder, but sentencing still had to determine how long Mackenzie would serve before any possibility of parole. At the sentencing hearing on August 21, 2023, family members spoke about the lives Dominic and Davion would never get to live. News 5 Cleveland reported that relatives asked for the sentences to be served consecutively, which would have created a longer minimum term. The judge instead imposed 2 concurrent life sentences, meaning they run at the same time, with first parole eligibility after 15 years. The sentence did not mean automatic release after 15 years. It meant Mackenzie could first be considered for parole after serving the minimum. The judge also imposed sentences on the drug possession and criminal tools counts, with credit for time served, and her driver's license was suspended for life. The case then moved into the appeals process. In September 2024, Ohio's 8th District Court of Appeals affirmed Mackenzie's convictions on direct appeal. The appellate court reviewed arguments about the juvenile bindover, the sufficiency and weight of the evidence, evidentiary rulings, and other issues. The court concluded that the evidence was sufficient for the fact finder to determine that Mackenzie purposely crashed the vehicle intending to kill Dominic and Davion. The appellate opinion also addressed the medical explanation. The court noted that while testimony allowed the possibility that Mackenzie could have suffered a medical emergency and later appeared normal, other evidence made that explanation unreasonable in the court's view. The opinion pointed to the accelerator, the lack of braking, and the manual gear shift movement. That did not end the case. Mackenzie and her family continued to maintain that the crash was not intentional. In later reporting connected to a new post-conviction effort, her side pointed again to medical evidence and argued that prior counsel had failed to fully present that theory. In March 2026, another appellate decision brought a procedural twist. Mackenzie had filed a petition for post-conviction relief. The question before the court was not whether the crash evidence should be retried. It was whether the petition had been filed on time. Ohio law requires a post-conviction petition to be filed within 365 days after the trial transcript is filed in the direct appeal. Mackenzie's side argued over the timing, including whether later juvenile bindover transcripts affected the deadline and whether the leap year changed the calculation. The appeals court rejected those arguments. The court held that the petition was filed on the 366th day after the trial transcript filing and that the trial court did not have jurisdiction to consider it. In other words, the petition was 1 day late, and the court said that even a 1-day delay could not be excused under the statute. That procedural ruling is one reason the case remains debated. To some viewers, the deadline issue looks like a technicality that blocked another review. To the state, it was a straightforward application of Ohio's post-conviction rules. Either way, it became the latest legal turn in a case that has never stopped producing arguments about intent, evidence, and fairness. The renewed attention grew again in 2026 when Netflix released The Crash, a documentary revisiting the case. Netflix's official materials described the film as examining how what first appeared to be a tragic accident became a murder case. The documentary includes interviews with families, investigators, and Mackenzie herself from prison. In that interview, Mackenzie maintained that she does not remember the moments before the crash and rejected the label of murderer. Her family continues to argue that a medical event could explain what happened. The prosecution and the courts that have reviewed the case have continued to point to the data and the trial record. That is the unresolved tension at the heart of this case. The courtroom answer is clear. Mackenzie Shirilla was convicted. The conviction was affirmed on direct appeal, and her post-conviction petition was dismissed as untimely. But the public debate centers on the one thing no camera and no black box can fully show: what was happening inside that car in the final seconds. What the car can show is speed, throttle, braking, steering, and gear movement. What witnesses can describe is the relationship history, the prior arguments, and what they saw before and after the crash. What the court had to decide was whether those facts, together, proved purpose beyond a reasonable doubt. The judge said yes. The appellate court said the evidence was sufficient. Mackenzie and her family still say no. As of the latest available records, Mackenzie Shirilla is incarcerated at the Ohio Reformatory for Women. Ohio prison records list her aggregate sentence as 15 years to life, with parole eligibility in October 2037 and a first parole board review scheduled for September 2037. For Dominic Russo's family and Davion Flanagan's family, this case is not just a legal debate. It is the permanent loss of 2 young men. Dominic was 20. Davion was 19. Their lives are the reason the case mattered in court, and the reason it continues to matter beyond the courtroom. For viewers, the key question is not whether this was a shocking case. The question is narrower and more important. What does the evidence prove? In the Mackenzie Shirilla case, the answer depended on a handful of seconds, a stretch of road, a black box, and a judge's conclusion that the crash was not an accident. The latest procedural update leaves the conviction standing. The next major milestone, unless another court action changes the path, Is parole review years from now? Until then, the case remains a study in how a fatal crash became a murder conviction, and how the final seconds of a drive can decide the future of everyone involved.